Welcome, friends, to the Pioneers of the Independent Networks. I'm your host, Ricky Blues. This is your co-host, Tim Walker. And friends, if you've joined us in the past, you know that we bring you all the matches, the characters, the promotions, the feuds, the organizations, the publications that populated the Mid-Atlantic independent wrestling scene from the 1970s to today. Tim?
I think that's my cue to say, that's a long time, Ricky.
That's a lot of decades.
A lot. And we've been around to see them all.
And that's part of the magic of what we like to speak about each week, the archives of wrestling, because you're not just a wrestling fan for 1 minute, one day.
That's for sure.
Like our old friend Sean Waltman used to say, you're in it for life.
That's a while.
And speaking of that, we're going to talk about a very extended portion of what made Pioneers, what made independence, what got the grappling archives across to people to put in their hands, even if they couldn't attend the matches. This week, what are we going to talk about, Tim?
Well, let's talk about some of the wrestling publications.
Just the publications?
Well, we can talk about the publications and maybe some people behind the publications.
Oh, I like that. You know, another part of it that I want to try and address this week, not only the publications, but looking at it in a whole, what the cover photo and stories meant. What do you think about that?
That sounds very interesting to me.
Awesome. We'll address that. And if we're going to address publications and those different venues in it, where would we be coming from this week?
Well, I think we may be coming from Ambler, Pennsylvania.
Home of?
The home office of Pro
Wrestling.
Illustrated.
And what press?
Kappa Publishing.
Absolutely.
Look at all these magazines.
That's a nice little notch, side notch in the development of this great beloved sport of professional wrestling that we all enjoy. Stay tuned, fans. Here we go. So, Tim, we've addressed publications way back in season 1, and we identified the importance that magazines, the printed press, played in the proliferation of so many organizations, not just at that time the top 3, but covering throughout the nation and international. Magazines were my first exposure to what was going on in Europe, what was going on over in Japan, what was going on down in Mexico. It gave you a flavor of so much more. And the one thing I always took away from printed press publications and magazines were their ability to feed you information, because now you had a little piece of that magic in your hands that was always an archive that brought you there, and it educated you on not just whatever your local station at that time, the wrestling that they was carrying. So for us in Baltimore, that was, for the most part, a WWF town. For the most part.
And a little bit later on, we would see Southwest Championship Wrestling.
Right.
And then Georgia Championship Wrestling.
Right.
And then I guess later on, the NWA.
Yep. But in order to have that knowledge, most of us turn to the printed press to actually start to broaden the horizons and say, wow, wait a minute, there's a lot more going on than just in the confines of those 4 corners of where I'm located. So it is, to me, the wrestling magazine, the printed press, was such a far-reaching, great tool that did a lot for this business.
I always loved to read the magazines to find out what was going on in different parts of the country. Say, for instance, Georgia or Florida, right, or even the Pacific Northwest, which didn't get a lot of attention, but still, whatever attention it got in the magazines, I would really like to read about that because it was an area of the country I didn't know a lot about.
Mm-hmm. It started to open your mind. And then when folks come into a territory, right, because of the exchange of talent, you had just a little bit of knowledge of who they were, but only on a I guess prima facie means, just at a face value. You didn't get that chance to see what they actually were like in action.
Right, but you still had a little bit of background into their personality.
Right.
You got to see the pictures. You got to kind of feel for the character. So it provided you with a little bit of background information before that person came into your territory. When you would hear like a Playboy Buddy Rose was coming into
Right.
the WWF territory, you could do a little background work and see what he was all about.
And that was a big thing because that windowed right into what we see so easy and take for granted today, that social network that we have.
Oh, right.
Because you had to communicate with your friends who were involved. And the other way of communicating, do you remember all the pen pals?
Oh, yeah.
And the little advertisements in the magazine that allowed you to connect with fans in other areas. I thought that was an incredible tool to develop the word.
I mean, the web now is such an incredible tool, and it provides almost everyone with the ability to publish their own story. But really, these magazines were the building blocks for that.
Right. And what I liked about it, don't get me wrong, folks, I think the digital age and social media and all that great stuff and social networking is wonderful. But can you hold it in your hands? And with a magazine, with a book, with printed press, you can actually hold that in your hand. It is like you own a piece of that history. In the web, you don't really own that. That's just out there. That's in a cloud somewhere, or you might pull a picture off, have a picture printed, but it's not this collection like what a magazine offers. It offers you so much more, and it puts you involved in it because it puts hands on, to me, and I think that's extremely important in your experience.
I do too. And today, if you miss one day's worth of news out there on the web, it's gone, really. Unless you do a lot of research and a lot of looking up.
Right.
It's really gone. But this, it's right in your hand. It's the information. It's available to you just as soon as you open that magazine.
There it is.
And if you don't have time to read this whole magazine in a day, you can pick it up tomorrow or you can pick it up the next day.
And come back to it. Exactly.
It's just really incredible to think, just for a few dollars, how much entertainment and how many hours of enjoyment that you get out of a magazine.
Exactly. And if you're like us, the archivalist who love to look at the past, there it is, at your fingertips always.
Yeah, that is a neat thing, that it's right there for you to look and grab a hold of, and it's a great tool.
You know, Tim, when I look at the magazines, there's a couple things that I like to think about. First off, the incredible nostalgia that's there. We've talked about that. The archive stuff. That is awesome. But there's also room in the magazine for everyone. Even though at times it seemed a little slanted toward WWF talent or NWA talent, but of course you've got to cover those. But there was always room in the magazines for the correspondents of Kappa Publishing to cover the independents and cover the overseas stuff. And I thought they did a good job, which always gave an introduction of folks coming up the ladder so that when they finally arrived and got picked up on a national scale, that people had an inkling of who they were because they had already started to develop. So it is a great developmental tool as well for the education of fans. I thought that was an awesome thing, and it was done in such reverence where the introduction didn't belittle anyone at all. It put them on almost an even playing field, but as someone much like a rookie who was working their way up the ladders.
Everybody has a story.
Right.
And there's a lot of interesting things that are behind the wrestler.
Mm-hmm.
A lot of human interest stories were presented that way.
Right.
And that made for some interesting reading. And it was a nice contrast between the national stars and the independents. And there was always a little bit of room in that magazine, no matter how chock full it was of WWF and WCW, later TNA. There's always a little bit of room for a human interest story. And a lot of the independents had very interesting stories to tell.
One of the things I like about the magazines, and I always have, is that they're visceral. In other words, they're visual. Professional wrestling is a visual media. It's all about capturing that moment, whether it's on celluloid, whether it's in a photograph, however that moment is captured. And that is one of the best attributes of the magazines. Their ability to capture and encapsulate a moment in time and present it for fans that's engrossing to them to draw them in. And when you look at the magazines, they are chock full of incredible photographs that at a glance portray the pain, agony, and blues, the Steel Dusties, line, that the eternal struggle, the hero's journey, their ebb and flow of failing until they finally succeed, all within the four corners of a photograph. Mm-hmm. That is an incredible, and I'm speaking to one of the best at it, an incredible little piece of history without folks knowing exactly that that's what it is, but feeling that whole magic through its exposition.
The magazines really had a gift for that.
Mm-hmm.
The right pictures to go with the right stories that could really draw the reader in and get you involved in the story. That was a gift, I thought, that a lot of the writers, and we had a lot of great photographers like Bill Apter, mm-hmm. George Napolitano, George Tahinos. There's so many more as well that really had a gift for that.
And you said it best. Not only did the photograph, because we're visual people, draw you in, but then you were really engrossed with the story that went with it to support it. One little clip, one little frame of life, and all these words that created incredible feelings and memories by just being placed on a page of paper for you to look at. Some of the story writers were, and not only, I can tell you this firsthand, not only were they able to create the story to draw you in, but they also gave breath and life to people who already existed. So you weren't just saying, yes, this is Ricky Blues, 6 foot, 232 pounds from Chicago, Illinois, but this is Hard Rock Ricky Blues, who has these likes and has these dislikes and has this bitter rival with this person who was trained by this person, brought up, who's made his way. So there was so much more there that the printed word that was augmented by pictures allowed you to delve into.
It would allow the reader to identify with you. And that's what went on within the pages of those magazines. But what is the first thing that you see when you look at a magazine on a newsstand? What would draw you in to wanting to purchase this magazine?
That action of the cover photo.
I think you're right. That cover would draw you in and want to make you buy that magazine.
That's the hook.
That is the hook.
Then once that hook is set, your interest is piqued. What do? You start page turning. And all of a sudden, you have to have not only the hook that grabs you, but the supplementary material that satisfies and makes you want more from that. It's a very, very incredible technique that takes a lot of experience to pick the right photograph, to place it with the right words, the right captioning, and the sell of a story to bring you in and make you say, this is what I need, this is what I need to read, this is what I want.
I think you're right. This is like a steak.
Right.
You look at it and you say, oh, wow. That really looks good. Mm-hmm. And then you cut into it and you taste it and you're hooked on it.
So, Tim, I'm going to rely a little bit on your experience here. When you choose a photograph that you're going to include in a piece, what are the attributes of that photograph that you look for in saying, this is the one that speaks to me, this is the one I need to use involved?
Well, you're right. When you say it speaks to me, that's exactly what I look for. I look for a picture that's going to tell me a story. And the rest of the pictures that go along with that article would supplement the story that's being told by the writer.
How did you go about choosing the right ones to make that reader want to tune in to the following issue?
That's a really good question, because we would try to tie in the pictures with the current storylines which were being played out in the arenas and on television. And we like to tie that all together in a big bundle so that it all fit together. And due to the publishing deadlines, that would make it kind of tricky at times.
Well, I can see. So you wanted folks to understand that this isn't a one-time event. This is a storyline, and there's something building in that feud that maybe this is the beginning of, maybe this is the end of, maybe this is where we've gotten to in that journey. So there's always a reason to go to the next one to find how that story continues.
And years ago, the writers weren't only just writers. The writers were characters as well.
Absolutely. Tell us a little bit about that, because you are a character yourself, and the folks, friends and fans out there only get to see a little bit, but the boys on the inside who've been in the locker room with you know what type of character you are. Tell us a little bit about that.
Well, let's talk about the characters in the magazine.
Okay.
One of my favorite characters in the magazine, Matt Brock.
Okay.
A lot of people told me that I kind of remind them of Matt Brock.
Mm-hmm.
As a matter of fact, a very little known fact, I actually wrote an article once that was published under the name Matt Brock.
Ah, it's a pseudonym, huh?
Were
Were you a ghostwriter for that?
Well, just once, but it made me feel like I was part of that character a lot.
That's awesome.
And Matt was the veteran, old, stodgy reporter that would wear the hat that said press on it. He's a great character. He would hang out at different places after the matches, trying to get a story. Just a real old-time reporter type feel to it. And his writing reflected that. Let's do something special. We talked about one of the great characters involved in wrestling magazines being Matt Brock.
Mm-hmm.
But one of the real characters behind the wrestling magazines was my friend and your friend, Bill Apter.
Bill Apter. Boy, if pictures paint 1,000 words, a moment with him paints 1,000,000.
He is a real character.
Bill is a character. I'm so proud to be friends with him. I'm so proud to be a Maryland Championship Wrestling Hall of Fame classmate, 2011, with Bill. So let's use Bill as our road correspondent, travel over through those wonderful airwaves that we have, and tune in right now.
I think that's a great idea.
Bill, we're shipping it over to you. The PWI, Pro Wrestling Illustrated luminary, the icon himself, the true pioneer, Mr. Bill Apter. Bill, welcome to Pioneers of the Independent Networks.
It makes me sound so old. I'm a pioneer. Where is the covered wagon I get out of?
Absolutely. That would help you carry around the archive that you created for fans.
Right, you're right. And when people always say the Apter mags, do you know who coined that?
I'm guessing Stu, but I'm not definite.
No. That was coined by Dave Meltzer.
Oh.
I'll tell you why. I was part of a team.
Right.
On many teams on the magazines. Stu Sachs, Dan Shockett, Craig Peters, Eddie Elner, Joe Bua, Ken Morgan, one of our art directors, Charlie Sargent, way back to Mr. Weston. So I was part of a team. But I was the guy that was out there in the trenches doing interviews,
right,
doing stories, doing photographs, a lot of photographs up on the ring. People used to look for my bald spots. It felt very home to them. But it was the whole team. And with Dave Meltzer, at one time in his newsletter, called it the Apter Mags, I called him and I said, Dave, we're a whole team of people. He said, but you're the guy that we see at the arenas, and you're the guy that the reporters put on television.
That's true.
So you're the face of the magazine, so no matter what your position is there, you're the face.
Wow.
Owns the place. Yeah, so that's actually where they came from. But yeah, my days at the magazines, I missed those very much. My days back at London Publishing with PWI as the flagship magazine. We did the Wrestler and Inside Wrestling and Sports Review Wrestling and Ben Strong Wrestling and Wrestling Annual, Wrestling Yearbook, so many. And then I went on to WOW Magazine.
Right.
And Total Wrestling Magazine in England. And by the way, they were gone for a few years, and they're back now. They're publishing again in England. Total Wrestling Magazine, and we're going to talk about covers.
Yes.
And for years, and I mentioned this on my after chat this week, for years, wrestlers nagged me to be on the cover. So I did some nagging, and guess what? I made the cover. So my return back to wrestling magazine journalism, the Godfather of wrestling, Total Wrestling magazine. I was the editor-in-chief of this for many years, and then it went down.
Right.
And then this gentleman named Aaron Wood took it over, and he brought me back, and I'm thrilled. But it's the cover that sells the magazine.
It is. Tell us a little bit about that, Bill. What was the concept going in? Because some people have told me, well, it was the cover that sold the mag that sold the cover. But I think being in the business, it was a lot more to it. You were trying, especially in all that area, to get so much out to people, to hook them, to bring them in, to educate them. So I look at it as more of an education tool to get all kind of markets all over the place, because everyone didn't get the chance to see many markets.
Yeah, now that's very interesting. But it took me probably 15 years at the beginning of my career to realize that the publisher of the magazine, Stanley Weston,
Right.
was a publisher, and to keep publishing, you have to earn the dollars.
Right.
So when preliminary wrestlers or mid-card wrestlers would say, hey, how can I get on the cover? I said, well, it depends how the promotion uses me. Oh, come on, Bill, we've been friends for X. Now, I wasn't the guy that made all the decisions on the cover. I would come back from a trip, let's say in the Mid-Atlantic area,
Right.
and we'd have a staff meeting every Friday to do headlines and decide what was going to be in the upcoming month's magazines. And I would say, there's this guy in the Carolinas that I just saw this week, this guy named Ricky Steamboat, and he looks good. I think maybe we should try him small on a cover. He's not a big star yet.
Right.
So we would, we'd take some chances on the, on a cover shot looking something, like this.
One of the insets, okay?
Square box, yeah. The main part of the cover, again, because it was based upon who's going to sell. And then it took ages to realize this, because I'd go into Mr. Weston, I promised so-and-so I'd be on. Well, you shouldn't have promised them.
Right.
Because he's on the main event. So the guy at the cover, at the head shot of the cover, the big shot of the cover,
Right.
was the guy who would sell more magazines than anyone else. Someone who was known on TV in every territory. Now, Bruno Sammartino was one of our regular cover guys.
Right.
And he was known through the legend of Bruno Sammartino, because he didn't wrestle everywhere, but he was built up so much in the wrestling magazines, everybody knew who he was. But then you had people like Dusty Rhodes. By the way, I'm trying to say your name in Dusty Rhodes. Thunder Ricky Bloom, baby. It just sounds so right. But a guy like Dusty Rhodes, who's on Florida TV,
Right.
Georgia TV, Mid-Atlantic TV, New York TV. So he's somebody that was on the cover all the time. Tommy Rich was seen on the Superstation. He sold magazines. Mil Mascaras sold magazines. So if a wrestler was the buzz all over because of what we might have done in the magazines to build someone like a Ricky Steamboat. He built his own career, but we helped the publicity and this. So that would be someone who would graduate onto the cover once we saw what the box office attraction was. Because again, like it's the wrestling business, it's the magazine business.
Right.
So make sure that the revenue was coming in. Hulk Hogan, of course, when he became, when Hulkamania started running wild, brother, he was on covers all the time. So yeah, that was the reason for putting people on the cover, was really the publisher's financial decision, because after the editorial department would say, we'd like to put Dusty Rhodes on the cover, Mr. Weston would sit behind his desk and go, tell me why.
Right.
We'd have to explain why, yeah.
The stories themselves, how would you develop that? How would you work in tandem with teams? Because you mentioned earlier you worked in teams to do that for this little splash.
Sure. So we would sit around every Friday, and I was the photo editor as well. And I would contact people like Tim Walker, used to be co-host, John Pithers, Eddie Cheslock, Floyd C. God, we had photographers everywhere around the world. Koichi Ashizawa in Japan.
Right.
And we would get pictures from them. We'd sit around, and Stu Sachs or Peter King, whoever the editor was at that point, would say, "What do you got, Bill?" And I'd pull out my folder. And by the way, this is all of this is revealed in my shameless plug of my book, Is Wrestling Fixed? I
Yes.
didn't know it was everything how we did the magazines. I'm not speaking for the magazines, but this is a story of what I did. And as photo editor, that was one of the most important parts of this, because in most journalism, the story comes before the photos.
Right.
Just the photos came before the stories. So we would sit around and say, "Well, what do you got in the folder?" And I'd look and I'd say, "Well, here's we have a set of pictures from Eddie Cheslock of Nikita Koloff against Ric Flair." And we'd say, "Well, what are they doing with this on TV?" And we discuss it and say, "Yeah, that's okay, but what can we come up with that might enhance this, something inside to make it saleable?" And we'd come up with an angle. And most of the time, the wrestlers and the promoters, they loved it, because it was making people read about them rather than just a bio, which could be stats. There was always an angle, like why Nikita Koloff wants to take the belt back to Russia. This type of thing. Make it interesting. And sometimes we'd call the wrestling offices, and sometimes we wouldn't, because a lot of the offices just gave us free reign. There were some wrestlers who we called to interview, legit interview, and they'd say, "You guys do it, just stay in my characters, you do it better than I do." Yeah, so that's how it worked. And then, of course, the photos were used, and we would work with the art department on, what's the lead photo here? Well, let's use this photo with Nikita pointing at Ric Flair's belt. That's a good dramatic photo.
Right.
If we have that photo, I might call an Eddie Cheslock and say, "I'm going to call Nikita to set that photo up. Can you go and see him on Friday?" And he'd go and get the shot. So that's how it worked. But again, the details, more of that is in my book.
Wow, it's always great to hear from Bill at Apter's Alley.
I tell you what, that is a man who, he's put a couple people on covers himself, hasn't he?
Yes, he has. Bill is probably the greatest, not probably, Bill is the greatest photographer that I have ever met.
Not only in this vein, but his eye to capture that one clip in time is so telling.
He has seen everything.
And his love for the business continues on. We got him to talk a little bit about his book there for a second. Folks, I'm telling you, it was a gift from Tim a few years ago, and we showed it on one of our holiday episodes. I'm telling you, you need to pick that book up. It gives you some insight of him, and the book we're talking about, obviously, is Wrestling Fixed. I Never Knew It Was Broken. That tells you a lot right there about what Bill, his thoughts, care, and compassion for this business. Because for him, this business is the world. And it is, he portrays that so greatly in a reverent manner. And we're so appreciative that he does it, he can do it tongue in cheek, but he still maintains that absolute professionalism. And to me, that's what stands out above everything.
What an interesting book, too. You open that book up and you start reading it, and you just can't put it down.
It's a page turner.
It really is. I really enjoyed it.
Chock full of photos that make you say, wow, did he capture the essence of the ebb and flow, the struggle, the blood, the feuds, the meaning of the storylines.
And the stories behind.
And the
stories behind of how he was able to get those photos and how he was able to get access to the information that he did. Very interesting.
Absolutely.
And his start working for Stanley Weston.
Yes.
It's a great read, and I really recommend it.
So do I. Absolutely. Pioneers of the Independent Network. We endorse Bill Apter's book. It's been out for a little while. It's a great read. It's great selling. We think you should pick it up. It's wonderful. And again, it's exactly what we do here as well. it done in a different vein, in a vein that I think that our folks out there would greatly enjoy.
I think so. I highly recommend it. If you get a chance, go down to your local bookstore and pick up a copy.
Yeah. Hats off to you, Bill Apter. Thank you for weighing in. Much appreciated. Great seeing you, too.
And so interesting to think back at all the different brands of magazines that there are, that the whole genre of wrestling magazines now are generally referred to as Apter mags.
As Apter mags, absolutely. Tim, we've covered a lot of material so far on our topic, but we are by no stretch of the imagination finished.
Boy, this is one of my favorite topics of all time. Wrestling magazines and wrestling covers.
And you know I'm an archives guy, so I love that we talk about those types of archives.
And I do too. You know I love this.
Absolutely. So what we're hoping, friends and fans, is that you join us next week as we continue this two-part look at magazines in the wrestling business, the importance of them for developing wrestlers, feuds, promotions, and we take that proverbial stroll down Concussion Lane.
We'll see you next week.
Absolutely.